What is going on, guys? Chris with Journals, Comics, and Pop Culture. Today, I'm talking comic books and movies, and boy, I don't know about you guys, but why is everything so controversial when it comes to comic talk these days? So, I'm going to explore why the comic book movies that we see now in cinematic universes, such as the MCU and DCEU, but just in general, do not have to represent exactly what came from the books. Now, I'm going to start this argument by going off of the fact that so many of us diehard fans uh, tend to attack the movies whenever they stray from anything from the comic books. But let me start with this. I do believe that in order for comic book characters to be a successful franchise in movies, or even in this case, we have television shows, whatnot, even animated, animated series and whatnot. There has to be extreme relevance to the source material. There does. So we talk about the roots of the characters, the roots of the storytelling have to be correlated clearly to the roots of the characters and the universe that we see in the comic book. That I will say. And one example of where I thought a film franchise strayed from, in this case, cartoons, is Transformers. So, because if you don't stick to the roots, why call it what it is? So, for example, Transformers, even though I appreciated the first one, I felt that the characters themselves in so much of that world and that environment was so far from anything even recognizable as Transformers, defeated the purpose of calling it a Transformers movie. Call it, and I've said this before, call it a robot alien movie, like robot aliens from the sky or something like that. It came so far away from the source material, and that's bad. So don't get it twisted here. I'm not saying that we can't have this bridge, right? So when you talk about, let's just use the MCU is a prime example, okay? And when we started diving into these characters, you had Iron Man and Captain America in terms of understanding their origin stories, right? So their origin stories, as told in the films, were extremely on point to what we saw in the comic books. To the T. You know, even with Captain America, I mean, just the whole aesthetics of that film really brought it back, including them taking Cap's, on stage performance of punching out Hitler and all that is references and whatnot to the early Golden Age comics. Moving forward, we've let's see, what other origin stories that uh, man. So shoot, bear with me. I mean, we haven't seen Black Widow's origin story, but we know it's there. We know it's relevant to the comics, uh, hands down. Spider-Man, we're not going to get into that. There's multiple reasons why we didn't see his origin story, and I'm not even going to get into that. That's a whole other conversation at this point. Black Panther. Black Panther origin story was extremely on point to the comic books. How he was introduced to us was different, but still the origin and the roots of the character were basically exactly the same. So now, when you go into the DCEU, we haven't really had many origin stories. We had a Batman that was more of an older Batman. He's been around for a while. Um, and we've had so many iterations of Batman in the comic books. So when you look at like Christopher Nolan's trilogy and that origin story, it depends on which timeline of Batman that you're looking at. And we most likely know that this new Robert Pattinson's Batman for Matt Reeves' film is going to be based on year one. So that brings us to two things here. One is, when is it okay to change from the comics? And two, what allows for what allows for iterations in the comics to work. So I'm gonna address these two things. Let's address the latter first. Let's address iterations of characters in comic books. I think that Batman hasn't necessarily gotten a lot of backlash for how we've seen him in cinematic roles, just because the comic books themselves, in the multiple iterations of Batman that we've seen, there's been positive fan reaction to that over the years, coming from the Golden Age Batman to the Silver Age Batman to the changes that we saw in the 70s, and then furthermore when Frank Miller came on board, year one, and whatnot, and we really saw this darker Batman, and then I think we saw Tim Burton really kind of bring that to life in a very great way back in 1989, right? So you already have a character that has comic books where he's been reinvented. So when you see that in films, I think fans and viewers are more at ease with that, if that makes sense. But why such an outcry and backlash over Marvel characters within the MCU specifically? Obviously, we've heard so much outcry of Spider-Man, and this actually sparked because there is I don't even believe it to be true, but there was an article going around about Wolverine possibly being gay in the MCU. I'm not even going to get into that because that's going to bring up extreme divisiveness. But a lot of what I read in those comments did inspire me to do this video, although I've been sitting on wanting to do this video. So, but why so much backlash? We look at small changes, which could be deemed as biases based on race or sexual orientation, as I just said. We saw that with MJ, being a mixed character instead of 100% white. We saw that with Marvel being changed into a woman, which I believe actually fit into the context of that film. All these things are, seem to be small, but yet there's so much outcry over them. But then we could talk about origin story and then story alone, right? Here's my thing about why I think it is good to not copy the comic books. Straightforward. For one, we have to understand that this is a different universe. It's a different universe. We already have multiverses in comic books where characters are getting recreated over and over again. Gwen Stacy. We have a Gwenpool. We have Spider-Gwen. Spider-Gwen's been a hit. You have different iterations of Peter Parker that worked with Ultimate Spider-Man, and then you have other new characters carrying on the torch like Miles Morales. And I'm not saying that these characters or stories are for everyone. It never is. It's never been that way. But there's always something there for everyone, right? So when you think about the movies, it's just like every iteration of different media. Like we have the gamer version. Now we have video games. Video games were never, especially this day and age with video games where so much storyline is at the heart of these games. You take it for what it is and just focus on the fact that it's good storytelling, right? That's what it should be all about. Let me use an example of the Infinity War Endgame basis, right? So we know that both of these films were more Infinity Gauntlet based. And let me tell you guys, let me ask you guys, for those that have read Infinity Gauntlet, how many of you would truly want to see take away Endgame, take away Infinity War, take those films away, and let's just say that the Russo brothers came in, or whoever directed it, and made a movie, or even a two-part movie, which would have been way too much in my opinion, and made it exactly like the Infinity Gauntlet 6-book series story. Can you imagine that? Now, don't get me wrong. Let's look at that in terms of a comic book, okay? We dove into a lot of great characters, and we saw Thanos for what he was in terms of his quest for power and his ability to even thwart like the all powerful entities. Infinity and Galactus. So, you know, we saw a lot of things play out in that we didn't really see in the films as well. But for those that have read these stories, what was the bulk of these comic books? It was either people sitting and talking in the middle of space or people fighting in the middle of space. And I'm not saying the talking and the dialogue wasn't good. I just said it was. It really, you were pulled into these characters. But can you imagine sitting for a total of 5.5 hours watching those comic books just play out exactly on screen? It wouldn't work. It wouldn't work whatsoever. Whatsoever. It would be a snooze fest. You have to be able to create cinematic storytelling for the cinemas, for film. You have to. Comic books are a different medium. Art form has multiple mediums. It can't be exactly the same. It won't work. It won't. That's just a fact of the matter. And here's another thing. Even if it did play out the way it did completely in the comic books. I mean, think of it. Spoilers for those that haven't seen Endgame by now, which I really hope you did. You know, I believe that the story arc of these characters that was built up and how it wrapped up with the death of Iron Man sacrificing himself. You know, and even with Cap's story arc seeming to end. We as comic book fans that have actually read the comics don't see this coming. And it adds so much more shock and awe to these films that allow us to enjoy them even more. To know the premise, to go into these films knowing the premise because we've read the comics, but then to still be surprised by the changes, I think is a big element of what makes them so successful. Okay? And you have, like I said, you have to be able to take context, roots of the stories, roots of the characters, and bring them into a cinematic universe that works as a cinematic universe. You have to. And we are in 2020 now. You know, you can't even tell the stories the same as they were back in the 40s or 60s or 70s even. Or even 80s and 90s. You can't. For many reasons. It has to be relevant to the times. Both in the technology that we showcase, in the production, and to the relevance of the characters themselves. So when we have to hold on so dearly to what we know, and we have no ability to be open to change, we are only hurting the hobby. We're hurting our own ability to actually enjoy this stuff for what it is. Go into these films with little to no expectations and come out with the expectation of what you watched. It should be that simple. I went into the new Star Wars films with no expectations other than I'm going to see characters that I love again for the first time in decades. And I came out of Force Awakens just happy as a little kid. I didn't have really any expectations for The Last Jedi except for the story's gonna continue, yes. But I came out of it disappointed because of the storytelling. Base it on what you see. And it's that simple. We gotta stop thinking that everything needs to be exactly how we want it. They weren't made for us as individuals, right? In the first place. So that's why I said, even with the comic books, there's always going to be stories that we can enjoy and some that we don't enjoy. And there's going to be others that are opposite to us that enjoy the things that we didn't and don't enjoy the things that we did. And it's going to be the same with film. And we have to allow the creative process to work. We have to. The fact that these movies are successful isn't some big conspiracy. You don't just have middle-aged men that collected comics in the 70s, 80s, and 90s as fans of these things. You don't. Look at the demographics. The demographics for the last two Avengers film were almost half, over 40% female for one. Now, hey, maybe wives go with the husbands and so forth. I get it, but still. And do you know that I believe it was about 47% were children and young adults up to the age or under 25. That means there's a whole new generation, and we shouldn't knock that. Oh, they only pander to, these young people that just watch movies. Stop. Stop it. We should be open to the fact that the younger generation are enjoying the characters that we grew up loving. And I've seen it with my own kids. And I've said this before in videos. I take my kids to see these movies, and they come out of them wanting to go read the comic books. So don't act like this new generation coming in is just watching the movies. They're not. A lot of them are going back and getting into the comic books because of them. Okay? So we really got to knock down the misconceptions. Okay? Now, I'm not even going to get into the details of what I feel weigh in on the biases of some people. I'm not. I'm going to leave that at that. I'm going to leave it at that. We can sit and have opinions of what we think might work and might not. Be respectful and humble in those opinions. Don't be prejudiced in those opinions. But then ultimately wait till the movie comes out. If somebody's race has changed, or gender has changed, or sexual orientation has changed, or appearance has changed, whatever it may be, story arc has changed, don't knock any of it until you see it on screen and say, this didn't work because of this and why. You don't know until it happens. And that's all I'm going to say on that. But I'm going to end this video addressing one more issue. And that is the fact of one thing that I think the comic book industry does need to take heed to. As much as I've sat here and advocated for the fact that the movies need to be fresh. They need to be fresh. To make them relevant, to make them current, and so forth. One thing that I want to see less of is the current comic books taking so much from the movies. We know that these movies, at root, take from the comic books, take from the classic characters and the classic stories. So much now, we see so much revamping going in the comic books because of the movies. Now, this goes back, I said I was going to come back to this, about the different iterations of Batman. Those different iterations of Batman happened in the comic books before movie influence. And I'm not saying that the movies can't always come back and influence the comics, but I do feel that it should always be the comics that are the stepping stone of influence for the movies in the future, for the most part. So I want to see, if we want to change different iterations in the comic books, which there have been, like Batman, let's do it organically from the comic books for the most part. Maybe we could pick and pull from the films, but I think there's a bit too much. And I'm gonna show why, or make an example to why I think it's too much, especially for Marvel, is because Marvel has taken so much from these movies that they, first off, oversaturate the market with just new tie-ins or recycled storylines. We already had multiple Infinity Wars, and then because we have an Infinity War coming out in the film, you're going to do a whole nother Infinity War. It's just, it's a bit much. But not only that, but it allows them to continue to reset these characters without it being not necessarily organic, but without the foundation of the creativity of writing stories for comic books. Now remember how I said comic books are one art form, and how the stories are told in cinema needs to be created in a way that works for cinema, and that goes the same with comics. Now, storytelling has evolved, and we've seen so much of how cinematic stories, whether it be in video games or movies or animated features like TV shows, come back into comics and allow those characters and those stories on the comics to evolve and be more alive. But still, there needs to be a root in storytelling that is relevant to the comics, and I think Marvel, uh, probably more than DC at this point, has kind of strayed from that, and I think they need to take a step back, allow the creative process of the comic book writers to shut out what's happening in the films, and just say what has happened in the books, and where can we go from here? Where can we take these characters from here? And then if they do that organically, it'll allow the movies then to come back and see what's going on in the comics and take from there. So I hope that makes sense. That's my spiel, guys. I really want you all to try your best. I know we get caught up on, especially as we get older, we get stuck in our ways. It's for every generation. Every generation gets stuck in their ways of how they see things and like things, whether it's with new technology or new storylines for favorite characters from comic books. But try to humble yourselves, guys, and understand what I'm saying and have an open-minded perspective. And don't be so quick to jump on something before you actually see the storytelling, in this case on screen, unfold. So that's my video today, guys. Let me guys know what you think. If you haven't subscribed yet, please do so. Be well, be kind to each other. Thank you for watching, and until next time.